Amelia Earhart is one of the most well-known pilots in history. Born 6 years before the Wright brothers' famous flight at Kitty Hawk, it might come as a surprise that Amelia did not develop her passion for aircraft until her teenage years. At the age of 10, she saw her first plane at the Iowa State Fair and was left unimpressed. It was a thing of rusty wire and wood and looked not at all interesting. It wasn't until years later when she attended an exhibition show that she fell in love. As the story goes, she and her friend were watching a plane overhead as the pilot turned their direction and dove straight at them. I am sure he said to himself, "Watch me make them scamper." I did not understand it at the time, but I believe that little red airplane said something to me as it swished by. In December of 1920, she would finally get her chance to take to the skies as a passenger on a flight. By the time I had got 200 or 300 feet off the ground, I knew I had to fly. She would begin flying lessons just a month later, setting the wheels of her celebrity rise in motion. Just 6 months after beginning these lessons, she would purchase her first aircraft, a bright yellow Kinner Aerister she named the Canary. Being the first plane she owned is not the only reason for its importance, though. The Canary would carry her into the skies for the first of many milestones she would set for female pilots, being the first one to fly to over 14,000 feet above the ground. A year after Charles Lindbergh successfully completed the first solo transatlantic flight, Amelia Earhart was approached to be a part of a project that would make her the first female to fly across the Atlantic, coordinated in part by her future husband and book publisher, George Putnam. "How would you like to be the first woman to fly the Atlantic?" he asked. Earhart excitedly agreed. Flying a Fokker F-7 along with pilot Bill Stultz and mechanic Slim Gordon, the team left Newfoundland on June 17, 1928, arriving in Wales just 21 hours later. 3 women had died in the previous year attempting the same flight, so her success took over the headlines worldwide. Upon returning to New York, her success would be celebrated by a parade and even a reception hosted at the White House by then-President Calvin Coolidge. She would not rest on her laurels for long, though. 5 years to the day after Lindbergh's solo flight, she would take to the air, attempting to become the second person of any gender to complete the feat. After battling strong winds and icy conditions for nearly 15 hours in the sky, she landed in a farmer's field in Northern Ireland. A shocked farmhand upon seeing her would ask, "Have you flown far?" Earhart replied, "From America." For this, she would again be recognized by the president when Herbert Hoover made her the first woman to be presented with a Distinguished Flying Cross. Amelia would continue to set and break records in the years to come, including an autogyro altitude record and becoming the first person to fly solo across the Pacific from Hawaii to California, which was a longer flight than her Atlantic crossing. Plans for her greatest feat of aviation began in 1936. Others had already flown around the world, but her intended flight path would be the longest yet, at about 29,000 miles. Financed by Purdue University, a Lockheed Electra was delivered which was built to Amelia's specifications. Earhart and her team would choose Harry Manning to serve as her navigator, but on a night test flight their plane would end up out of position by about 20 miles, which was a cause for concern for George Putnam. They would begin the search for a supplemental navigator and would land on Fred Noonan. Previously, he had worked for Pan Am establishing seaplane routes across the Pacific, as well as training some of their navigators using a route between the Philippines and California. They intended to use this experience in the Pacific to have him navigate for Earhart as she flew from Hawaii to Howland Island before surrendering his place to Manning, who would navigate to Australia before leaving her to fly the rest of the way by herself. Their first attempt to circumnavigate the world would be a short-lived effort. They would leave from Oakland, California on March 17, 1937, heading to Honolulu with Earhart, Manning, Noonan, and pilot Paul Mantz on board. By the time they reached Hawaii, the Lockheed Electra was already in need of maintenance. After a delay of 3 days, they would finally attempt to leave the island. During takeoff, though, the forward landing gear would collapse, causing the bottom of the aircraft to slide across the ground, damaging both propellers and the runway itself. Some witnesses claimed it was caused by a tire blowing out, but Paul Mantz would go on record calling it a result of pilot error. Because of the extensive delays caused by the crash, Harry Manning withdrew himself from future flight plans, leaving just Earhart and Noonan with no experienced radio operator to attempt the trip the second time. For the second attempt, they would fly east instead of west, with the trip technically beginning with no fanfare as they flew from Oakland to Miami. There, they formally announced a new plan for circumnavigation. I have a feeling that there is just about one more good flight left in my system, and I hope this trip is it. They departed from Miami on June 1st. 28 days later, they would arrive in New Guinea with only about 7,000 of the 29,000 miles left to go. The next destination was set to be a small 1.5 mile by half mile stretch of isolated land called Howland Island in the middle of the Pacific. They stripped the aircraft of any unneeded weight so they could load as much fuel as possible for the challenging leg, giving them around 250 miles of extra range. U.S. Coast Guard cutter Itasca would serve as their radio contact station offshore of Howland Island. 2 more U.S. ships were spread along the route and ordered to make use of every light possible to act as a beacon for Earhart and Noonan. They would spend 3 days in New Guinea before taking to the skies for the final time at 10 a.m. on July 2nd. The weather after takeoff was near perfect, but soon they flew into clouds and rain showers, causing some difficulty for Noonan's celestial navigation. Earhart contacted the Itasca, saying, "Cloudy weather. Cloudy." She would continue to contact him numerous times to take her bearings, which they would do, but she never received their return transmissions. At 7:42 local time for the Itasca, they heard a faint, staticky message from Earhart saying, "We must be on you, but we cannot see you. Fuel is running low. Been unable to reach you by radio. We are flying at 1,000 feet." About an hour later at 8:45 a.m., Earhart's final message went out over the radio. "We are running north and south." They were never seen or heard from again. A search and rescue mission was hastily organized about an hour after Earhart's final radio transmission. Some signs of life were initially spotted on Gardner Island. Here, signs of recent habitation were clearly visible, but repeated circling and zooming failed to elicit any answering wave from possible inhabitants, and it was finally taken for granted that none were there. After weeks of searching at the cost of over $80 million in today's money, the most expensive search and rescue to that point in history, the mission was called off. Countless planes and ships scoured over 250,000 square miles of the Pacific, finding no evidence of the plane. Noonan and Earhart were declared lost at sea. George Putnam then financed his own search of the same area, but also found no trace of his wife or the plane that carried her and Fred Noonan nearly around the entire world. Some theorize that they made it to Gardner Island and were able to land the airplane on a reef nearby instead of continuing to fly aimlessly searching for Howland Island. According to her radio transmissions, they were flying along a course that would have taken them past a series of small patches of land called the Phoenix Islands, one of which was Gardner. During the search mission, the USS Colorado did report that they saw recent signs of inhabitation, but in October a more thorough search was conducted and no plane was found on or near the island. Decades later, in 1988, the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery investigated the islands for themselves. They too theorized that the Lockheed Electra had landed on the reef near the island and that the pair had died before they were able to be found and rescued. On the island, they found improvised tools, an aluminum panel, and a piece of plexiglass. There were attempts to settle on the island, and it was also used by the Coast Guard for a navigation station, so the tools have a plausible explanation. Underwater scans using an ROV found no evidence of a plane on the reef. Pictures of the Electra from before the trip show a panel over a window on the right side of the plane that appears to have the same rivet pattern and similar dimensions as the one found on the island. In 2017, the New England Air Museum claimed the panel matched a piece of the wing from a Douglas C-47 Skytrain they had in their possession, which is significant because a C-47B crashed on a nearby island during World War II. Debris from this crash could have plausibly washed up on Gardner Island. In 1940, numerous bones were found on the island. A doctor at what is now called the Fiji School of Medicine examined them. He determined they belonged to a middle-aged, stocky man who was only about 5'5", which is 3 inches shorter than Amelia Earhart. More recently, though, scientists examined his data and claimed it was plausible that they matched Earhart's estimated bone lengths. Unfortunately, the bones were misplaced at some point in Fiji and lost to time, so DNA analysis is not possible. There were also radio signals reported after Earhart's final confirmed transmission. On July 5th, a Navy radio operator in Honolulu received a Morse code message allegedly saying, 281 North Howland, call KHAQQ, beyond north, won't hold with us much longer, above water, shut off. An amateur radio enthusiast in Melbourne, Australia also reported Morse code messages that used KHAQQ, which was Amelia Earhart's call sign. Some also think that Earhart Noonan somehow made it far enough from Howland Island to venture closer to Japanese territory, where they either crash-landed or were shot down, before being taken into custody by the Japanese military. This would have put them hundreds of miles out of range for the fuel they had left while in contact with the Itasca at Howland Island. In 1990, on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries, a woman from Saipan claimed to have seen Noonan and Earhart getting executed by Japanese soldiers.
This woman was brought ashore by the Japanese. The Japanese soldiers brought the spies into town. Many of us went there to see them. When they took her out of the prison, they tied her hands. They blindfolded her. The woman was in a little seat on the side of the motorcycle. I watched, and they took her to this place where a hole had been dug. They made her kneel in front of the hole. Then they shot her.
우대!
Various pictures have also surfaced supposedly showing Earhart in custody of the military. The original source of these photos was eventually tracked to a Japanese travel guide published in 1935, meaning that there was no way it could have been Amelia Earhart in the images. The most fanciful theory for where the legendary pilot ended up is that she faked her death and assumed a new identity. In 1970, a book called Amelia Earhart Lives claimed that she somehow survived the flight and ended up in New Jersey under the name Irene Bolam. Irene immediately and vehemently denied this assertion, saying she lived in Long Island at the time of Amelia Earhart's final flight. While she did objectively hold some resemblance to Amelia, she would go on to file a lawsuit for over $10 million in today's money for damages. The book was quickly pulled from store shelves and the publisher settled out of court with Irene. All evidence researchers dug up regarding her life indicated she was factually not Amelia Earhart. The most likely and logical explanation is that they simply ran out of fuel and crashed into the Pacific Ocean. At 6 a.m. that morning, Earhart estimated they were about 200 miles from Howland Island. Nearly 2 hours later, she radioed, "We must be on you, but we cannot see you. Fuel is running low. Been unable to reach you by radio. We are flying at 1,000 feet." After another hour, she reported, "We are on the line 157-337. We will repeat this message. We will repeat this on 6210 kilocycles. Wait." The signal strength, as measured by the Itasca, did not appear to get significantly weaker, indicating that the Electra did not fly very far from the immediate area of the island. In 1982, retired Navy Rear Admiral Richard Black, who was in the radio room on the Itasca that morning, said, "The Electra went into the sea about 10 a.m. July 2nd, 1937, not far from Howland." In January 2024, a company called Deep Sea Vision that operates unmanned underwater vehicles claimed to have found what appears to be the remains of an airplane on the Pacific Ocean floor. They say the object matches the shape of the Electra, lying at a depth of about 16,000 feet and within 100 miles of Howland Island. By comparison, for just how deep this is, the Titanic rests at a depth of 12,500 feet under the ocean. This is an entirely plausible place for Earhart and Noonan to have flown that morning. This story is still very much in development, so we do not currently know for sure if this is indeed the final resting place of Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan. At the time of recording this video, Deep Sea Vision is currently planning another expedition to gather better visual evidence later in 2024. Amelia Earhart inspired countless women during and after her lifetime to pursue their dreams. She had become a celebrity during her life before her final flight, but her legend exploded after her disappearance. We do not currently have a definitive conclusion to the story of Fred Noonan and Amelia Earhart. But with independent companies like Deep Sea Vision and others like them still searching, there is hope that we one day will.